Alright, this video is on measuring and marking and cutting. Measuring is the most important first step in cutting well. If you do not have a good mark, if you do not have it accurate, you will not be able to cut a good line. You will not be able to make your wood the right size, and therefore you're going to have things out of square. You're going to end up with a structure that is not able to stand up well because it's out of square, because it'll have difficulties because there's going to be gaps and so on. All in all, tremendously, tremendously important, and we'll be talking about all these things today. We will also look at, inside of this PowerPoint, the different types of cuts that are there, different types of tools that we use for measuring and marking. This will all be possibilities for the quiz, the first quiz that we'll have coming up, that goes along with the PowerPoint and the video, woodworking versus building construction. So let's start out with a few things that we've seen in the past, and that is these two slides. Those of you, again, who had woodworking with me, were able to focus a little bit on the inch and on our marking system here in America versus internationally. Most countries use what we don't use, which is called the SI, the System International Metric System. That is comprised of the millimeter, centimeter, meter, kilometer, etc., all based on one main unit of measurement, the meter, and then breaking it down or multiplying it. While that would be very simple, we don't use that in our country, and I don't project that we will anytime soon. Ours instead is called the customary system, which is a rather arbitrary system of measurement that we then break down or multiply as well. Our main system, our main component of this system is made up of all sorts of different types of measurements, including the inch, and inside of the inch we have eighths, sixteenths, quarters, halves, and so on, as well as the foot, which is comprised of course, 12 inches, and the yard, which is 3 feet, and then the mile, which is 5,280 feet. Relatively arbitrary, but now that we have them in our heads, and you guys have been working on them within math classes for so long, you have a pretty good idea of things. But we do need to remember that our measurement of the inch is tremendously important when we're doing woodworking. When you have woodworking measurements, you're measuring longer distances than you were in the past. Building construction measurements, you're working with longer distances relatively than in woodworking. So instead of using a bench rule, our main type of measuring tool is the tape measure, which grabs onto one piece of wood or abuts a piece of wood or a wall or something, and then of course unrolls to the point that we have a specific measurement to take. And then that measurement is probably somewhere along the lines of 137 inches as opposed to 16 inches, because we're measuring typically longer things. So 137 and something like 3/8 of an inch, and so on. We'll be going back over this. You'll have to identify some lengths again on the first quiz that you have in building construction. But as you can see, as you remember, you divide the half, and you divide that in half to get a quarter, you divide that in half to get an eighth, and you divide that in half to get a 16th. And speaking upwards, you start with the 16th, and you always then go to the lowest common denominator, the lowest possible, and that means eighth. You have to reduce it. You don't ever say 2/16. If you're ever on a job site and you say, this is 137 inches and 2/16 of an inch, you'll sound like a dope. Instead, you're going to want to say 1/8 of an inch or 3/8. And the point at which you can get to and should is saying things like, if that's the case, let's say it's 137 and 3/8 inches strong. That means it's not even necessarily up to this next mark, which would be 7/16. It's maybe just a little bit longer than this one. So when you're setting the line, the person that is good at cutting will set that line just a little bit strong, cut on the outside of the line with a circular saw or sliding compound miter saw, etc., and make it just perfect so that it's nice and snug. So that is the inch. Once again, there's a lot of types of rules we have used in the past we will continue to use, but obviously our tape measure is going to be our most important. We know these right here from last time we had this course. This is the folding wooden rule. Helpful if you know how to use that well. A lot of people don't use that as much anymore. Instead we use the bench rule and the tape measure. But here's the calipers. Here is our standard bench rule for woodworking, and then finally our tape measure. That's the Stanley Fat Max tape measure. You'll want to get a good high quality tape measure or it will not lock very well as have too much movement right here on the end. You want a little bit of movement because of the way it butts up to something and gives you that measurement versus grabbing onto the end. That thickness of this itself needs a little bit of movement on the end, but you don't want too much or too little. You don't want this to crack. You don't want this to, as you're extending long distances upward into the air, to quote-unquote break in half and not be able to just withstand a further measurement coming up from your tape measure. So you'll get used to how that works as we go along. There's other types of squares we'll be using as well. We are very familiar with the tri-square, upper right-hand corner. That's what we used a lot of, as well as the combination square, which is bottom left-hand corner. But typically in building construction, you want something that is a little more durable, and you don't need it quite as precise as a tri-square, but easily able to fit in your tool belt. And there are two main types of squares we use here, upper left-hand and bottom right-hand. Those two are the speed square, which was named so by Swanson, and since then it's become pretty much a standard in the industry, kind of like Kleenex is a type of bathroom tissue. You just say Kleenex here, you just say speed square. That is the Swanson speed square. It has a pinpoint, it has common lines, and I will teach you how to utilize this well also for things like rafter framing, which talks, and you'll see on our speed squares, our orange ones, hips and valleys and so on, which are able to be used for creating repeated cuts for your rafters and for your angle cuts, as well as over here. But it also makes a nice straight line to go back to speed square, because you set it on the edge of the wood, you draw the line quickly. It works very well there. On the bottom right hand corner there, you have a rafter square, and this particular square is an excellent square for making bigger, longer cuts. It draws a nice straight line as well. This one is a carpenter square, also known as. You will be using this one as well to set out some lines too. Once again, use the same sort of ways you use this to set it up against something, but you just kind of angle it against the wood it's abutting to. And this one also has longer measurements too, so you can go, in many cases, up to 24 inches of measuring something and making that line also. Finally, we have ourselves this little contraption, the sliding T-bevel, which can be good for transferring marks from, let's say, something that was built, rafter built by somebody a long time ago. You want to make that exact same angle cut. You then take this over to it, make that measurement or adjust it accordingly with the little wing nut right here, and then you can come back over to your piece of wood and make that cut exactly. Very convenient, especially for building decks and odd angles and so on. Now, when you're marking material, long stock, you're going to be using a tape measure. Wide stock, a framing square, a carpenter square, or a chalk line. What that means is, when you're making a length measurement, typically you start off with the tape measure, and then you pull the measurement from the end, whatever you need it to be, make the mark, and then for that stock, then you have to make it, let's say it's a 2x6. You have yourself a speed square, you set that on a line, you mark your line with a pencil, a carpenter's pencil, and then you make your cut. But if you have something like a panel good, a 4x8 sheet of plywood, then you're going to want to pull the mark from both sides. Say it's a 50-inch mark on a 4x8 sheet of plywood pulled from an end. You're going to want to pull that on both sides of the wood, make the mark on both sides, and then stretch across that. Either you would have a very wide framing carpenter square, long carpenter square, or you would have yourself a chalk line. And on the right-hand side there you see a chalk line. A chalk line pulls from one edge, chalk goes inside of that, and then that line pulls all the way to the other mark. You tighten that up, and then you pull the chalk line up and let it snap onto the wood. This creates a line that can be cut on as well. That is a very typical way also to mark stock. So you always need a pencil. In your tool belt, you always want a speed square. You always want a chalk line. You always want a tape measure. Those are the very important tools of measuring and marking your stock to get a good cut in. Now there's 4 types of cuts, as you'll remember from woodworking as well. The 4 types are your cross cuts, which I was just describing to you on the sheet stock. That would be a cross cut. There's also a rip cut that would be with the grain. Kind of tough to determine grain on big panel goods, but if you're going the long way, that's a rip cut, even on a table saw on a job site. A miter cut and a bevel cut. A miter cut is not shown on here on these pictures, but that would be 90-degree angles except for to the face. So right here would be a 90-degree angle or 45-degree angle, let's say, that you could make with your speed square, and then you would make that with a sliding compound miter saw, not on this angle right here, but you would just turn this miter table right here to cut this way along the wood. A bevel cut, on the other hand, is going to go in the wood this way, and that bevel is going to be against the edge, the end grain there. And that's with a sliding compound miter saw. You see them making a bevel cut right here, all clamped down with their Bosch sliding compound miter saw. On the bottom right-hand corner here is your circular saw, which I'll talk about in the next video. And the circular saw is able to make miter cuts. Obviously, you start a cut here and go across the wood, as well as bevel cuts, which would be able to make right here. All you have to do is change this plate on the circular saw. And then finally, you can even make a compound miter by following a line right here on a bevel. That requires a very strong blade, a very good person at running the circular saw as well, but that can be done as well. In our next videos, we'll talk about the circular saw, and we'll look at that on page 119.